The North Korean leader's sister Kim Yo-jong says a visit by Japan's Prime Minister Kishida to Pyongyang could be possible. Recent progress in South Korea-Cuba relations seems to have affected this political calculation, and tonight we hear from South Korea's Unification Minister himself about this. More than 300,000 jobs were added last month in Korea, driven by older adults and more hiring in the healthcare sector. Trainee doctors at the nation's major hospitals announced to tender their resignations to protest the expansion of medical school admissions quotas. Patients' concerns have grown, and the government today renewed its stern message. It's February 16, 2024. This is Newscenter. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Min. We start with the remarks by the North Korean leader's sister, Kim Yo-jong, having suggested inviting Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida to Pyongyang if conditions are met. Much speculation has been made about what could be behind this reckoning, and tonight we hear from Seoul's Unification Minister Kim Myung-ho himself about this. Our North Korean affairs correspondent Kim Jong-sil had a chance to sit down with him.
Unification Minister Kim Myung-ho told Arirang News that Kim Yo-jong's statement came amid the historic diplomatic development between South Korea and Cuba the day before.
I think North Korea must be in shock witnessing South Korea establishing diplomatic ties with Cuba. The only way for North Korea to get out from diplomatic isolation is to give up on its nuclear weapons as demanded by the international community.
Some experts warned that Kim Yo-jong's statement may be aimed at trying to sabotage the trilateral relationship between South Korea, the U.S., and Japan. But Minister Kim said this will not be affected.
The trilateral cooperation system between South Korea, the U.S., and Japan has never been more concrete since the Camp David summit last August. North Korea will never be able to get to Washington and Tokyo without going through Seoul.
On Thursday evening, Kim Yo-jong released a rare statement saying that there may come a day when Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida visits Pyongyang, so long as Japan does not bring up issues related to Japanese abductees and the regime's nuclear and missile programs. The statement came as Prime Minister Kishida said last week, now is the time to make bold moves and change the current situation, referring to relations with North Korea.
If Japanese and North Koreans make a bilateral deal, there will be a tension or differences of opinion between the allies in the situation between Korea, Japan, and the United States. And this is exactly something that the North Koreans are trying to achieve here, essentially to drive a wedge between Korea and Japan.
But the outlook for a possible visit to Pyongyang by Kishida seems unlikely under such conditions. On Friday, Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshimasa Hayashi said Japan could not accept Kim Yo-jong's conditions. The Japanese government acknowledges 17 citizens having been abducted by North Korea between the late 70s and early 80s. Kim Jong-sil, Arirang News.
In other news, to better support young scientists and researchers, President Yoon today vowed to provide more financial support for young scientists and researchers at another policy debate session held in the Science City of Daejeon. He also tried to alleviate concerns about the government's recent budget cut in R&D. Our Kim Do-yeon reports.
As part of efforts to foster more talent in science and tech, President Yoon Suk-yeol has introduced a stipend program to provide full-time grad students in national research programs. At least 800,000 Korean won, or about $600 per month, for master's students and $820 for people doing PhDs.
먼저 우리 이공계 학생들이 학비나 생활비 걱정을 덜고 학업과 연구에 매진할 수 있도록 전폭적인 지원을 펼칠 것입니다.
This came as he hosted the 12th livelihood policy discussion with scientists in Daejeon, known as South Korea's Research and Development City. He also put emphasis on the nation's research facilities collaborating with each other as well as ones overseas to make a, quote, quantum jump in the nation's research scene. The announcement comes against the backdrop of the government reducing the 2024 R&D budget by 15%, marking the first cut in 33 years, which has raised concerns among the scientific community about diminished support amidst reforms. Yoon tackled that head-on.
그런데 이러한 그 혁신 과정에서 지원이 줄어드는 것은 아닌지 염려하시는 분들도 있는 것으로 알고 있습니다. 전혀 걱정하시지 않아도 되고 오히려 훨씬 더 좋아질 것이라고 오늘 제가 확실하게 말씀을 드리겠습니다.
Other plans to support R&D include speeding up the development of a second science park in Daejeon's Daedeok-gu district, which follows the Daedeok Innopolis. Also saying that empty research facilities mean nothing. There will be better infrastructure in the region, including Chungcheong Train Express, to connect nearby major cities. While in Daejeon, President Yoon also attended other events to meet with the nation's students in sciences, sitting down with 200 of them, including Science Olympiad winners and national scholarship recipients. He reminded them of the tremendous role they have for the nation while reiterating his will to provide support.
여러분이 어떤 의문을 가지고 어떤 질문을 하느냐 그리고 어떤 해답을 찾기 위해 노력하느냐에 바로 우리나라의 미래가 걸려 있습니다.
He also gave a commencement speech at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology graduation, where he told them to not fear failure and to boldly take on challenges as he does what he can to get them support. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Trainee doctors at the nation's major hospitals announced to tender their resignations to protest the expansion of medical school admissions quotas. Patients' concerns have grown and the government today renewed its stern message. Shin Se-byuk has this report.
The government on Friday sent a stern message to doctors who are planning to go ahead with the collective submission of letters of resignation to protest the government's recent decision to increase the number of medical students.
We will issue individual directives to resume work for the residents who have declined to see patients. Should these directives be ignored, we will proceed with appropriate legal measures.
The Yoon Suk-yeol administration announced last week a plan to increase the overall medical student quota by 2,000 to over 5,000 by 2025 to address chronic doctor shortage in rural areas and specific medical fields. The government has also ordered 221 training hospitals nationwide to ban any mass leave-taking and to retain essential medical personnel, warning of the possibility of the latter's licenses being revoked if they do not comply with the ministry's immediate return-to-work order in the event of a strike. The government's solid response came as trainee doctors at 5 major hospitals in Seoul decided to collectively submit letters of resignation. According to the Korean Intern Resident Association, all residents at 5 major hospitals in Seoul will submit their resignations by the 19th and will stop working after 6 a.m. on the 20th. The so-called Big Five hospitals are Seoul National University, the Catholic University of Korea Seoul St. Mary's, and Severance Hospitals and Samsung and Asan Medical Centers. Some of the hospitals have confirmed that all of their residents have already agreed to hand in resignation letters. As of Thursday, according to the Health Ministry, a total of 154 letters have been submitted at 7 hospitals, although none have been accepted. If the collective action goes ahead as planned, it would mark the 4th time doctors have taken such action since the first medical strike in 2000. Meanwhile, medical students nationwide have decided to submit leave of absence requests en masse for February 20th, next Tuesday. This decision followed an emergency meeting held on Thursday evening by representatives from 35 of the nation's 40 medical schools. During the meeting, all participants unanimously agreed to coordinate the submission of the request while ensuring unified action across all 40 medical schools. Another meeting to further discuss plans for upcoming action, including the possibility of boycotting classes, is scheduled for later on Friday. However, according to the Education Ministry, as of Thursday afternoon, no leave of absence requests had been submitted to the schools. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
Korea's annual job growth rate rebounded to the 300,000 level last month, with workers in their 60s and above boosting the rebound. Our Lee Soo-jin has more.
South Korea's on-year job growth has recovered to the 300,000 range for the first time in 3 months. Data released by Statistics Korea on Friday shows that there were 27.7 million people in employment last month, up 380,000 from the previous year. This also marks the largest on-year job growth recorded in 10 months since March last year. Job growth was primarily led by an increase in employment of those aged 60 and above, which recorded a 350,000 rise, while there were also increases for those in their 30s and 50s. On the other hand, employment figures for people aged 15 to 29 fell by 85,000 compared to the previous year, showing a decline for 15 consecutive months. While an on-year drop for 40 to 49-year-olds was recorded for the 19th month straight. In terms of different job sectors, the healthcare and social assistance sector saw the largest number of job additions, with more than 100,000 people hired, followed by the science and technology and construction industries. And the manufacturing sector also recorded an increase for the second consecutive month, with an addition of 20,000 new hires last month. Employment in manufacturing tumbled from January to November last year before recovering in December.
The growth in the manufacturing sector was partly due to the base effect, but the auto and medical sectors are also seeing a rise, and while the electronics and chemical sectors remain sluggish, they are also showing signs of recovery.
And during a job task force meeting held on the same day, the first vice finance minister announced that while January's employment figures are encouraging, the government will remain vigilant.
We will continue to respond and monitor risk factors amid concerns about geopolitical tensions and sluggish construction orders. We will also promote hiring programs to create 1.14 million jobs in the first half of the year.
The vice minister also pledged that the finance ministry will continue to focus on implementing measures that will lead to an export-oriented recovery and expand women's participation in the workforce. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
Seoul's finance ministry says exports and manufacturing production are tangibly on track, but spending and construction investment are lagging behind. Shin Ha-young with the details.
South Korea's economy is continuing its recovery momentum with strong manufacturing production and exports. That's according to the Economic Green Book released by the Finance Ministry on Friday. The ministry's description of the country's economy has changed to recovery momentum is continuing from the previous reports. Signs of recovery are expanding. This is mainly due to a rebound in exports and manufacturing production.
Exports continue to rise, and in mining and manufacturing production, there have been consecutive increases for the last 3 quarters. With these factors, the economic recovery momentum has strengthened further.
In December, production in mining and manufacturing went up by over 6% from the year before, driven by chip sector, which saw a jump of over 50% in output on rising demand. The country's exports continued to increase for the 4th consecutive month in January. There was an on-year increase of 18% in exports last month as demand for semiconductors continued to improve and shipments to China grew for the first time in 20 months. However, the ministry pointed out that the pace of recovery differs across sectors, with signs of sluggish private consumption and stagnant construction investment becoming more evident. In December, retail sales, a key gauge of private spending, dropped 0.8% from the previous month. Construction investment fell 2.7% on month and over 1% on year. There are rising expectations for a recovery in the IT industry and a soft landing for the global economy. However, it evaluated that uncertainties still remain due to geopolitical risks like the war in Ukraine and the outbreak of conflict in the Middle East. In response, the government plans to continue to manage potential risks while also focusing on improving people's livelihoods by implementing key policy tasks identified during livelihood policy discussion with citizens. Shin Ha-young, Arirang News.
Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok unveiled plans for the partial easing of people's financial burdens and stock market reform today at a press briefing. A fuel tax cut, which was due to expire this month, will be extended for 2 more months until the end of April in light of rising oil prices. The tax cut provides a 25% discount on gasoline and a 37% discount on diesel and liquefied petroleum gas. As for the corporate value up program that aims to raise the prices of undervalued stocks on the domestic market, the minister said that the fine details of the plan will be released later this month. A video of frozen kimbap has gone viral on social media, making more people outside Korea wonder about this food. An Song-jin went out to see what's so special about this rice-based product.
A quick snack or meal widely consumed by South Koreans, kimbap has been increasingly getting attention from outside of the country. It's usually made fresh, but the trend recently is kimbap that's frozen. Korean-American digital creator Sarah An's TikTok video of first trying frozen kimbap went viral with more than 10 million views. She said she was speechless and incredibly happy on how Korean kimbap has become so widely known in the U.S.
Basically, every Korean market which never carried frozen kimbap, now sells their own brand, and all those get sold out. So I think it's become a staple that's just going to become more accessible as time goes on.
This company in Hadong, Gyeongsang-namdo province, produces an average of 13,000 frozen kimbaps a day using local vegetables. This is not only for domestic consumption, but also for export to nearly 20 countries. Once a kimbap is frozen, it can be stored for nearly a year and just needs a few minutes in the microwave. As products that contain meat cannot be exported, the kimbap that's shipped abroad is vegetarian and comes in varieties containing tofu, burdock, spinach, or other ingredients.
We want to eventually build factories outside of Korea so we can produce a wider range of kimbap with fewer limitations. So far, we've achieved our goal in branding kimbap not as Korean sushi, but as something originally Korean with its own name.
An expert says that there's more to the wave of Korean food than simply increased interest for Korean content, including K-pop, through social media.
Most importantly, this is all possible due to a vast improvement in South Korea's food processing and storage technology that allowed such products to be exported in good condition and taste for consumers abroad.
On the back of increased attention for convenient and healthy foods such as this frozen kimbap, exports of South Korea's rice-based processed products saw a hike. The value of exports exceeded $200 million for the first time last year, which has quadrupled the number from 2015. To enhance competitiveness in the market, the government plans to increase the exports of rice-based processed products to $400 million of exports by 2028. It will also promote growth by investing in R&D and infrastructure. An Song-jin, Arirang News, Hadong.
The president of the Korea Football Association, Chung Mong-gyu, today made the decision to dismiss Klinsmann, the head coach of the men's national team. After South Korea's disappointing performance in the Asian Cup semifinal, fan discontent escalated after what they saw as Klinsmann's lack of tactical acumen and leadership skills. Following the demand made by the KFA's national team committee on Thursday for Klinsmann to be replaced, the decision was made at Friday's emergency meeting by Chairman Chung, who himself is facing pressure to step down. Klinsmann's contract was supposed to run until the 2026 World Cup, but leaves after just 1 year in charge. It is Friday, and we are back with our weekly arts and culture segment. Joining me is our culture correspondent, Song Yoo-jin. Good to see you, Yoo-jin.
Good to see you too, Jungmin.
What do you have for us today?
Well, Jungmin, it's been quite a while since we talked about cinema and arts and culture, and actually the annual Berlin International Film Festival just kicked off on Thursday local time. And as you know, it's one of the most prestigious film festivals around the world, and Korean films have been leaving their mark since 1961 when director Kang Dae-jin's The Coachman won the Silver Bear, which is the second highest honor. And this year's lineup also includes several Korean films. So for this week, here's a preview of what you can enjoy at this year's Berlinale.
The bear hunt begins.
The Berlin International Film Festival, or Berlinale, is back. Held every February, it stands among the world's top 3 film festivals alongside Cannes and Venice.
The Berlin International Film Festival began in 1951 as a symbol of Germany's post-World War II reconstruction and international reconciliation. It screens a diverse array of films from independent films to documentaries, animation, and experimental films. The festival is known for inviting artistically profound films valuing diversity and multiculturalism.
Around 200 films will be screened over 10 days in the German capital, with 6 Korean films in the lineup. Among the 20 competing for the main competition category is director Hong Sang-soo's latest film, A Traveler's Needs. This marks Hong's 5th consecutive year of being invited to the Berlinale.
Despite winning 3 silver bears at the Berlinale, Hong Sang-soo has yet to clinch the Golden Bear, the festival's highest honor. This time, his movie features veteran French actor, the internationally beloved Isabelle Huppert, so A Traveler's Needs can win this time.
In the short film category, there's Chung Yoo-mi's Circle. With this 7-minute black and white film, Chung has become the first director to be invited to the Berlinale 4 times with an animation. Meanwhile, Kim Hae-young's debut feature, It's Okay, aims to capture the hearts of young people in the audience. The film is competing in the Generation K+ category with juries including children between 11 and 14 years old. Beyond the competition, the 4th installment of the Roundup series is making its world premiere at the Berlinale Special Gala. A cult thriller Exuma starring Choi Min-sik and the Korean-Japanese documentary Voices of the Silenced will be screened as part of the Berlinale Forum and Forum Expanded. The winners of the major awards will be announced on February 24th, a day before the festival comes to a close.
Loads of excitement ahead of the Berlinale. Eugene, as we kick off the festival, how was the opening on Thursday?
Right, so the festival kicked off with a screening of the opening film, which is Small Things Like These, directed by Tim Millans, also produced by actor Matt Damon and starring actor Cillian Murphy. Now, this Irish-Belgian production, competing in the competition category, is set during Christmas 1985, depicting Ireland's Magdalen laundries, which are asylums that were run by Roman Catholic institutions from the 1820s until 1996, which forced young women to work in slave-like conditions.
And Eugene, what else can we look forward to during the festival's 10-day run?
Right, so the Berlinale is known to be the most political among the big 3 festivals that I mentioned. So this year it's going to offer visitors a chance to have an open dialogue on the Israel-Hamas war. So a meeting space called the Tiny House Project will be set up from Saturday to next Monday at the Potsdamer Platz Square. And also this year's honorary Golden Bear Award, which recognizes exceptional artistic careers, will go to the Oscar and Palme d'Or winning American director, producer, and screenwriter Martin Scorsese. He'll receive his trophy next Tuesday, followed by a screening of his 2006 thriller, The Departed.
Much to look forward to. Keep us posted. Thanks, Eugene.
Thank you.
Today, a day before the weekend, the cold snap eased off during the afternoon. Tomorrow will mostly be sunny across the country, and the air will be clean without fine dust. It will be a little chilly until tomorrow morning. Then temperatures will rise from the daytime, going back to as cozy as early spring again. The weather will be warm enough to do outdoor activities. However, with a rise in temperatures, do expect wide temperature gaps in daily readings. Most regions will see a gap of around 10 degrees or more. It's much easier to catch a cold under such fluctuating temperatures, so make sure to dress in layers. Tomorrow, Seoul will start off at -1 degree Celsius. Daegu and Gwangju, 0 degrees. Daily highs in Seoul will get up to 10 degrees. Daegu and Busan, 14 degrees Celsius. This weekend, the entire nation is forecast to see rainfall, and this rain is expected to continue for a long time until the middle of next week. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world. That is Newscenter for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session up next.
Welcome. 엄청난 에너지를 춤으로 뿜어내는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니? 웰컴. 시간 불이 꺼지지 않는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니? 하나, 둘, 셋. Hey, Mr. Cupid, make sure you listen to what I say. I may be stupid or quite naive. 끝없이 쏟아지는 포토스팟. 휴대폰 한 대로 감당할 수 있겠니? 잡아줄까?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Washington's consumer prices have been announced and are hotter than expected. Investors have scaled back bets that the Fed will begin cutting rates as early as May. Meanwhile, South Korea's inflation is slowly being tamed. However, uncertainties from the Middle East region linger. And now that the U.S. is not expected to cut rates any sooner due to sticky inflation, the Bank of Korea faces a dilemma over the rate-setting decision. Today, Within the Frame aims to ask experts about what would be on BOK's mind and, if time allows, how Korean Air and Asiana are just one step away from forming a mega carrier after the EU regulators' recent approval. For this, we invite Professor Kim Se-won from Ewha Women's University. Professor Se-won, welcome.
Good evening.
And we also have Professor Hwa-Kyun Kim from the Mays Business School at Texas A&M University. Good to see you again, Professor Kim.
Good to see you again.
All right, Professor Se-won. So U.S. CPI has been released, showing it rose by 3.1% in January. Now, inflation did cool down, but the figure was higher than expected. How did you see the data?
Well, it is true that U.S. inflation pressure is weakened over the last 12 months. The first half of last year's U.S. inflation stayed at 6% level or near, but it decreased down to only a 3% level recently. But January's increase in prices was the largest in 4 months and occurred against the backdrop of labor market strength and economic resilience. In January, U.S. consumer price rose more than expected amid a surge in the cost of rental housing. Particularly, the rental housing cost accounted for more than 2/3 of the rise in January's CPI. But I would say that this month's higher than expected inflation could be a temporary rise. We see some seasonality, which is economic jargon actually, in January's inflation, because January is typically a strong month for inflation readings as businesses pushed through prices increases at the start of the year. So to summarize, U.S. inflation is slowing, but probably not fast enough to encourage Federal Reserve to start easing rates soon.
All right, I see. Well, it is indeed a relief to hear that this is going to be a temporary, phenomenon. But Professor Hwa-Kyun, with inflation and pressure not easing off that easily, the Fed was widely expected not to begin rate cuts in May. However, new data today suggests that retail sales fell 0.8% in January, much lower than expected. So, based on all of this, what decision do you believe Fed will make?
I mean, at this stage, everybody seems to be gathering more information and try to get some more clues. So it's time of uncertainty, I believe. So even in terms of the inflation expectations, I looked at multiple sources, and one of them actually was about 2.9%. And lots of media, including Wall Street Journal and New York Times, used this to quote that it's actually hotter than expected because actual inflation was around 3.1%. But if you looked at all the different sources of forecast, it was kind of rather wide in terms of range from like 2.4% to 3.5%. So clearly higher dispersion in forecast means there's more uncertainty in information. So the new data release that you just talked about gives some extra points of data that, maybe, it's not going to be just that late because the economy is cooling down probably, but still it's just one more data points and people have to see and wait. And according to the Fed Watch data, that's kind of showing the expectations and distribution based on the Fed futures. In May, about 35% chance of lowering the interest rates. And in June, it's about 65%. And then in July, about 90%. So it was a bit higher in March, but now I think it's almost close to like 5% to 10%. So most of the market participants actually who are handling bonds think of it as more like around the 35 to 50% between May and June in terms of lowering the rate.
All right. With all these uncertainties, I believe we would just have to wait and see. All right, well, Professor Sehwan, we also need to take a look at South Korea's inflation. Seoul's inflation did fall below 3% for the first time in 6 months in January, but grocery prices, including for fruit, are still very much high. Could you tell us more about this figure?
Compared to U.S. inflation, we have kind of different situation in Korean inflation. Korean inflation slowed to a 6-month low in January this year. The January inflation stood 2.8%, higher than the same month the year before. In previous month, which is December 2023, the annual inflation was 3.2%. And in January, the core inflation, which excludes volatile food and energy items, rose 2.5% on year. This is weaker than a 2.8% rise in the previous months. And actually, it is the weakest since December 2021. So we can see that Korean inflation is significantly weakening recently. But there are some concerns because this slowing inflation is related to slowing Korean economy. This year's Korean economic growth forecast is only 2% level, which is not enough to recover last year's economic recession. And also there is a high possibility that Korean inflation might rebound to 3% level anytime as the geopolitical situation in the Middle East is driving up oil prices and domestic agricultural products prices rise.
Right. As our Professor Sehwan already mentioned, Professor Yoon, with uncertainties in the Middle East, many worry that unstable global oil prices could accelerate inflation yet again. Now, how worrying is this? Could you tell us more about this?
I think it is a valid concern. And also these are the biggest oil producing and exporting countries. And it's probably not as important for the U.S. inflation, but for Korean economy, because the Korean economy relies a lot on the Middle Eastern countries, the oils for many of these businesses. So I think that's probably a concern. Of course, the silver lining is nowadays the oil supply is quite diverse, I think, in terms of the supply sources. So usually whenever that happens in terms of like some instability, then the U.S. and some other countries start increasing the oil supply. So typically the duration is relatively short. And also core inflation usually just excludes the energy price because it's just too volatile, which basically means that it's going to be relatively temporary. But I think it can impact some businesses at the margin, or especially who are actually somewhat in small scale. So I think probably the Bank of Korea has to look at closely about that in just measuring their, the timing of the interest rate changes.
All right, I see. So though we have diversified sources for the supply, it is indeed a valid concern. And to curb this potential inflationary pressure, Professor Sehwan, just several hours ago, the finance minister announced the extension of the tax cut on fuel consumption by an additional 2 months. Now, how do you see this? Was this a proper measure?
Well, Korean government extends fuel tax cut temporarily in every 2 months from last year. Except today's extension, most recently, government extended tax cut on auto fuels by another 2 months in January through the end of February. As we know, it is an effort to curb inflation amid lingering global geopolitical risks, despite recent declines in international oil prices. Since international oil prices pretty much stabilized at $80 per barrel level, and inflation is also relatively stabilized, as we talked about so far. Korean government can finish fuel tax cut in sooner or later, but there goes something very sensitive issue, actually political issue related to the fuel tax cut extension. This time, the political situation that we have general election in April would help to extend the fuel tax cut for 2 more months. Also, the fact that oil prices could always turn higher abruptly makes Korean government to extend the fuel tax cut to decrease economic uncertainties of households and firms. However, in the long run, it would be difficult for Korean government to extend fuel tax cut continuously because government is suffering from tax revenue drop from last year.
All right, I see. All right. Well, Professor Hwa-kyun, we are going to make a forecast on what decision BOK is going to make. But before that, I'd like to also talk about the growth outlook. The Korea Development Institute on Wednesday kept Korea's growth forecast unchanged at 2.2% for this year. However, it added that it would be very much difficult to expect a recovery in private consumption. How concerning is this?
Well, I think probably today's theme is mostly about uncertainty. So I guess even KDI has difficulty forecasting, the economic outlook, especially related to consumption. So, I mean, there are a lot of situations going on. And also at the same time, political situations also changing a lot in that, like elections coming up. And usually around the election, government and also the other parties actually try to just really give more positive signals and try to make more like optimistic policy changes and things like that. So it's all kind of mixed up. So KDI's models, predictions, because I have several students who got the doctors actually from my guidance, and actually they're working in the KDI and they're pretty good, but I'm sure that they're the forecast actually have very insignificant results, so they're actually not very confident about what to say. So maybe that's actually why. So for the time being, I think we have to still gather more data and see what happens. But the sentiment clearly is not very high. I can see that, and I recently read an article, and then the rate of the restaurant closure national-wide seems to be the peaking this year, and it was about like 10% last year. So I think clearly there's some concerns.
All right, I see. Well, up till now, based on our discussion, it seems there are so many factors to consider. Professor Tae-wan, what might be the BOK's decision at its upcoming rate-setting meeting?
I believe Bank of Korea will leave its key interest rate at current 3.5% in coming interest rate decision meeting next week. Since Korean economy's growth momentum is pretty much weakened from last year, there are many reasons for Bank of Korea to cut its key interest rate below 3.5%. Last year's economic growth was 1.4%. And as Professor Kim pointed out, this year's economic growth is expected to be about 2.2%. And the need for additional rate increase has been reduced as inflation continues to slow, and risks related to international oil price and overseas risk like Middle East crisis have been weakened too. But at the same time, Bank of Korea has reasons not to cut interest rate. Lower interest rate might cause many other problems, like stimulating an expectation for real estate price increases and therefore household debt increases. Also, lower key interest rate of Bank of Korea increases the interest rate gap between U.S. and Korea, which is 2% as of now. When the base interest rate gap increases as Bank of Korea cut its key interest rate, there can be problems in exchange rate control and capital outflow by foreign investors. So I believe that Bank of Korea would cut its key interest rate after seeing Federal Reserve interest rate cut.
All right, so for now, Bank of Korea is highly likely to keep the rate and then see how it goes in order to begin the rate cut. All right. Now, shifting gears a bit here, Professor Hwa-kyun, the EU regulator decided to give a conditional nod to the Korean Air Asian Airlines merger deal. What is this about? And I hear this would eventually be beneficial to low-cost carriers such as TUA Air. Is this right?
Yeah, that's what I read, and the EU's conditional approval of this Korean Air Asian airline merger is like a big step, of course, in terms of consolidation of the South Korea's aviation market, obviously. And this decision, I think, is, of course, the contingent on the Korean Air's kind of divesting certain assets, especially the Asiana's cargo business and some routes actually to the TUA Air, which is a South Korean low-cost carrier. So I think that's basically kind of Korean Air's proposal to remedy this type of the European Commission's request because they're worried about antitrust and anti-competition issues. So I think the divesting routes to the Barcelona, Frankfurt, and Paris and Rome, and by surrendering them clearly to T-Way Air, I think they can actually, these low-cost carriers actually can some benefit in terms of the expanding their routes to other countries and therefore increasing the competition, I think. So that's kind of the context that you seem to be asked about.
All right, thank you for your context explanation. Well, Professor Sehwan, so the proposed merger has received approval from 13 countries so far, including the recent EUs, and now is waiting for the final approval from the United States. How do you see this going?
Well, there are some mixed expectations about gaining approval from U.S. government in merging Korean Air and Asiana Air. The merging between Korean Air and Asiana Air faces with virtual final hurdle of receiving approval from United States regulator. Previously, Korean Air and Asiana Air have received approval for their merger from Japan and EU's competition regulator. This means that, as you talked about, they received approval from 13 out of 14 countries that can give approval. But predictions are mixed on how tough U.S. Will become about giving approval on this merge. Basically, this merge is on issue of weakening competition in global air travel market, as Professor Kim pointed out. And therefore, U.S. government can be strict on this issue because U.S. government has been historically more strict about private corporations merging for stronger market dominance. But there are quite a few positive factors to get approval from U.S. government. U.S. government has an aviation liberalization agreement with Korean government, which allows Korean airlines to operate services to U.S. territory without serious negotiation. So many experts have fewer concerns about gaining U.S. Approval.
All right. Well, based on what our Professor Sehwan told us, it seems it could be quite tough to get this final approval from the U.S. And it could take some time to get through the entire process. However, Professor Hwa-Gyun, if the merger deal is finalized, what would it mean for Korea's flight industry?
Overall, I think the industry is going to have some good, news. Although I think, the one potential concern is because it's so big now, it's basically just one large company with some low-cost carriers. I think that's going to have some issues in terms of like monopolizing this business, and then especially with the airfares nowadays surging because of inflation. If they're monopolized, I think the price is going to go potentially even higher. So I think that's the concern. But in terms of overall, the profitability, because the flip side of that is like the Korean Air, Asian Air will have some good windfall of profits. So I think profitability is going to increase, and they probably can better compete with other large carriers worldwide, such as American Air and Delta and then other places. So overall, I think it's going to be a good thing. Similar to banking industry, I think this one actually really needs big fixed cost investments. So I think the large, the size actually helps. But in terms of the antitrust concerns and also a little bit of this inflation worry because of the airfare surge, that's kind of something that, even if the merger deal actually worked, both the industry and the government have to think a bit about that.
All right, I see your point, Professor Hwa-Gyun. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Hwa-Gyun and Professor Sehwan, for your time and insights today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Always my pleasure.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.
Roundtable presents experts' briefings on the global issues of the week, followed by a Q&A session that delves into the problems affecting the international community. What's the impact on Korea's domestic affairs? We analyze the present and the future of Korea. Arirang's premium nature documentary, Premium Collection. Capturing Korea's 4 distinct seasons and the creatures of forests. We also explore the origin of world civilization.